All right, everyone, thanks for attending. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And today's webinar, we're going to cover container controls for desktop applications. I have 4 projects that I'm going to be going through today that will walk through some of the some of the uses for container controls. So the only things I want to point out is just if you have questions as I'm going through, by all means, just type them into the question window. I'll review them as I'm talking and try to answer them as I'm going along. So feel free when you think of a question to just type it in. That way none of us forget. So without further ado, let's fire up Xojo here. Now container controls. What's a container control? Well, let's open up an example one first. A container control is a control that lets you add other controls to it. So you can see here, right on the insert menu, there's container control. And if you add one to your project, oops, did I not click it? Now it won't let me add one. I don't know why. I'll do a new project. I don't think that's locked, but it's possible that the file's locked on the drive. All right, let's see. We'll do a new desktop project. And click on container. So we get our container here. And you can see it looks pretty much like the layout editor for a window. You know, you get a blank canvas. You can click on the library. You can drag whatever you want in here. You can put any controls you want in here, lay them out however you would want, as if, you know, you were laying out your window. You can resize it. And then once you have a container you like, you can actually just drag the container right onto a window. And then you'll see right on the window the controls that are on the container itself. You can't modify them directly here. They're kind of, you know, they show a little grayed out to show you that they're there, but you can't tweak anything with them. If you needed to reposition the individual controls or do anything related to them, change the properties or whatnot, you have to go back to the container itself. And when you run your project that has a container, you're not going to see this border that appears around it. The border is just there to give you a visual indicator of what belongs to the container while you're doing your layout. So if we run this right here, you're just going to see those buttons kind of in the middle of the window. There's no indication that they're on a container, and they operate just as if you would drag them directly onto the window. So that's all well and good, but why would you want to use a container control? Well, let's switch back here to the example that I have. Now this particular project is an example of, I kind of made a little fake app here, and it shows, it's got a page panel, and on the first panel of the page, it shows some customer information, and I just typed this data in to just demonstrate how you can use a container control, but this is a common design pattern that you see here. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's a list box with some stuff, some fields that would get filled in theoretically as you clicked around here. And on the second page is some information about orders. So if we were to run this little example, you would see, you know, you got page 1 here showing up. And if I went to a view menu, I implemented it so that it just essentially switches the page when you pick the menu item. And all it's doing there is switching the page panel control. But the on each page panel control is the container, or it's a container. And the container has all this stuff laid out on it. And we'll look at it in a moment. But this particular design is beneficial because, one, your window is now incredibly simple. You look over here on the window, all you have for controls is the panel itself and the containers that are on it, that are on each page. And that's it. You don't have your window all of a sudden cluttered up with, well, let's see here. We got a list box on this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 text areas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 labels. Text area, sorry, these are text fields. Another text area. Plus, if you'd added all these on the page panel directly to the window, you'd end up with another label, another list box, a couple buttons, a couple fields. So all of a sudden, your window has a whole bunch of stuff that's on it. And a lot of these things may not even be directly related. which makes managing your window a lot more complicated than it needs to be. In this particular example, and it's just because of the way, I made my fake example. I mean, theoretically, what you see here on this page here, this customer information, is not really related to what's being shown on this page, which is a list of recent orders. What's selected on the first tab doesn't affect the second tab. So these are pretty distinct things. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to just throw all that stuff on the window and have everything there kind of getting in your way. So the first thing that container control does is allows you to better organize your projects. So if we jump down to the containers themselves, you can see right here, this is what the container looks like for the customer layout screen that I made. And again, this would look just like how you might lay something out on a window. There's a list box here, a bunch of text fields, labels, positioned however. The important thing to remember, though, when you are setting up your container control is to properly adjust the locking. And you're going to want to lock the controls themselves. You're going to want to lock the container appropriately so that it can grow and resize. And then when you add the container to the window, you're going to want to set the locking back over here. So there's a lot of locking things that need to be set. And that's only if your stuff needs to resize, which generally you're going to want it to do. So you can see here when I resize things, everything grows the way I want. And that's because I went through and made sure that the locking was specified everywhere. And if I had forgotten something, then the window would resize, but the particular control wouldn't. So it's always good to just double check that, because with a container control, there are more places that you have to set your locking. But that's really the only big thing to worry about. So other than that, your layout is exactly the same. The other benefit of doing a layout like this, of course, is in addition to your controls all being nicely encapsulated, if you will, into their own space, you can also encapsulate any supporting methods or properties or whatever that's needed to make this user interface control or container work. And again, that reduces the complexity of your window. So if I had some methods on here or properties that were related to saving or adding new customer or whatnot, that would just belong right here on the container. It wouldn't have to be on the window. You would probably make the methods public on the container so the window could call them, but the window wouldn't actually be the owner of those methods. And as we look at some of the next examples that we're going to get to, we're going to actually have some actual running code that we'll take a look at to see how to do things using containers. This example doesn't have any code whatsoever besides the switching of the panel. It's just showing the layout. So this is what one layout can look like. I want to take a look at the orders container so you can see what this layout looks like, because this is showing an example of a container that has a container on it. So yes, you can nest these things. So right here at the top is a search container. And then underneath it, I have the list box that contains the orders, and then I just have a button down here. Now, why would I bother making this search container, this search thing its own container? Well, I could have just thrown the buttons on here. Well, exactly the same reason as why you might not want to throw everything onto the window. Maybe you want to simplify this thing. Maybe your search thing is a more generic container that you use in multiple places on your application. Maybe I want to use this search container on the customer and put it at the top. The search container could have logic by itself that automatically knows what to do when you click the search button, and there could just be search methods down that it calls. So again, it depends on how you want to organize your project, but there's really no limitation on how you can lay out the container controls. Nesting them is certainly easy to do and really quite common. And you can see the search container right here, which is just a smaller container. So again, to touch on, some of the things you can use container controls for, obviously you can just bundling controls up into one place so that you can more easily work with them. This allows you to reuse your stuff more easily, better segment your application, encapsulate information as you need it. Custom controls are a great use of container controls. You can, of course, subclass any built-in control, but sometimes you might want to make a compound control, and we're going to look at one of those next, where your custom control has one or more controls in it. Perfect use of a container control. Dynamic, adding controls to the user interface dynamically. Container controls, as we did here, can be added, when you're designing. But you can also add a container control to a window or a tab panel at runtime. Again, incredibly useful. And we'll look at an example of a tabbed web browser that shows how you might use something like that. Excuse me. And yeah, I guess those are the main points I want to hit. So again, container controls do a heck of a lot. And we're going to see some more powerful examples of what they can do in just a moment. So I want to make sure I have everything covered here in the overview. So is there any high-level stuff people have questions on before we start diving into some of the more powerful uses of container controls? And I do want to point out here that you're looking at the Xojo IDE. Now, I don't know the specifics of how many containers are on here, but I can guarantee you there are quite a few. And I bet the navigator itself is some sort of container. This filter, I bet, is a container. You're probably looking at a container here for both the library and the inspector. The center area certainly is a container, and probably a bunch of containers depending on what's being displayed. So we use these things all the time to create Xojo itself. All right, so let me switch to the next project. Now I did a brief overview of this sometime last month in one of the Q&A webinars, which prompted a lot of questions about containers, making it pretty obvious that we need to do an entire webinar on them. But this example is actually included with Xojo. And this is an example of a custom control. Actually, I'll run it first so you can see what it looks like. So you can see here, I ran the project, and the buttons here, because I'm running on OS 10, cancel is on the left, OK is on the right. And if I click cancel, it says you click cancel. If I clicked OK, it says you clicked OK. Well, if you look at the layout, OK is actually on the left and cancel is on the right. And this is how the buttons appear when you're running on Windows and Linux. So if you want a nice looking app that looks appropriate across platforms, you're going to want to switch those buttons around. Mac users are going to flip out if they see OK and cancel buttons in this order, as Mac users tend to do when they see things they don't like. Vice versa, if you said, well, I'm going to cater to the Mac people because, they're the most vocal, and you flip your buttons around, well, Windows and Linux users probably won't complain quite as much, but your app won't quite feel just right to them, and they might accidentally click buttons because they're in the wrong places. So the easiest thing is to just, flop them around. Well, why not make a container control that you can just drop into your project whenever you need OK cancel buttons? It does this for you automatically, so you don't have to worry about writing code for this every time. And that's what we have here. The OK cancel button is a container control, and all it has on it are two buttons. And it's specifically set up right now using the Windows and Linux organization. And the buttons are on here and they're specified or whatnot. And what happens is there's just some code that's on this. And it's all pretty basic code, but it just checks if it's running on OS 10. And essentially, if it is, it flips the buttons around by changing the text and what's the default and which one's the cancel button. And the text for the cancel and what's called the action button or the OK button is just specified in properties. So when you put this control on your window, maybe we have it. Here we go. I have it set up so that the two text properties appear here in the behavior section of the inspector. And I'll show you where you can specify that should you want to be creating your own custom controls. But so right here in the inspector, I've added two new fields that normally would not appear for a container control. But now you can just type them in and to change the text of the buttons. And that ends up getting passed along to the container control, and when, depending on the platform, the stuff is switched around and everything works great. And then there's a few other things that happen with in order to trigger the right events, rather than directly dealing with the action event of each button, we have code on the container, go to the action event, that checks which platform you're running on and calls the appropriate event definition down here. And that's what you deal with, you can see right up here on the window. So you're not dealing with a specific buttons action event, you're just dealing with global action and cancel action events on the container itself. So it allows you to provide your own API or your own interface to how your custom control works, and essentially hiding everything else that's on there, which again makes it easier for people to use your stuff. Now, if you wanted to tweak, what was displayed here in the inspector, you can go back to, if I remember correctly, I think we got to go to the properties, and we come right here. We click. I right-clicked on the properties, and then you select inspector behavior, and that shows the little window here that displays essentially all the properties that are available for your control, and you get to pick which ones you want to show or hide or whatnot. And somewhere down here at the bottom, here they are the two ones that I've added, action button and cancel button. And I just checked them, and that by the act of just simply checking them makes them appear on the inspector. And you can specify default values if you want it, just by kind of double clicking in there. So that's how that works. Container controls are a great way to make custom controls that are generic that you use in every project, or even custom controls that are maybe only needed for one particular project because they're specific. But I've used them for making selectors to look up information that are commonly used throughout the project. This OK cancel control. Pretty much you're gonna something will come up and you'll be like, oh, well, of course that should be a container. Now that I've thought about it. So again, this project is included with Xojo right now. So you can actually grab it, play around with it, use it in your own projects. The other projects that I'll be showing you today, including the first one, will be available with this webinar download on the website within a week or so. And they're also going to be included in Release 3 of Xojo. I just have to go through and clean them up a little bit, but they're just about ready to be included with all the rest of the examples. I'm going to have a new container control folder with several container control examples in there for people to refer to. All right, so if there's no questions on these two examples, we're going to start to take a look at the more complicated ones. So let's look at the tabbed web browser example. So I'll just run this here. They're not too pretty. There's no nice pictures for the icons or anything, but this is an example of how a web browser might work. So I'll just type something in here. This will default go into Google. And, it works like a web browser, title showed in the tab, whatnot. I could create a new tab, type in a URL. I could right click on something, tell it to open in a new, actually it says window here. I don't know if that's actually changeable, but I have it set up so it'll capture the process and actually throw that up in a new tab. So we've got multiple tabs coming up here. Resizing works pretty much how you'd expect. And a couple, if I click here, I don't know if I have all the toolbar buttons hooked up, but I think back is hooked up. So if you click back, it actually goes back. It's like, well, that's great. That's pretty cool. It looks like a pretty bare bones tabbed web browser. Well, how is it that you can set up such a thing? Because we don't know how many tabs there are up here. Right now I got 3. There could be any number. So we can obviously add the tab at runtime using the tab panel.append method. But how do we add the container control to it? Well, and that's part of container control's ability to be added at runtime. So let's take a look at some of this code. Before we get to all of that, I'm going to show you the container itself. And you can see here this particular container is relatively simple from a layout standpoint. It just has an HTML viewer on it to actually show the web page. And it has an address, a text field up here for storing the URL or the search thing. If you don't actually type a URL, it'll send what you typed off to Google search. There's a bit more code behind some of this, and we'll look at that in a moment. But this is just what we're looking at for the layout of the container. Pretty simple. We open up the browser window here, and you see just a big old window that just happens to have a tab panel on it. And I've actually removed all the tabs from the tab panel, so there's no tabs on it, so it doesn't show the little indicator here. And that's because I'm adding the tab when the window opens, because that calls code in here to actually add the tab the way that I want. So it has a big blank tab panel on here, but there's nothing on the tab panel. It's just a big blank tab panel. And you can see that it doesn't have any expansion here or anything like that. I did create a simple little toolbar for handling, the back and forward and that sort of thing. And that's been added on here. And there's also a timer, which we'll look at in a moment, that's just responsible for updating titles and whatnot. But if we go, when the window opens, it calls this add tab method. And this here is the code that adds a new tab to the tab panel and then embeds into the tab panel the container. So you can see here what's going on. First thing we do is just adding a new tab to the tab panel. We give it a generic title of, call it untitled. Since we're appending it to the end, we know that the page is just, the pages are counted 0 to, or 0 base. So we have to take the full count and subtract 1 from it to get the maximum page number. So we create the new page. We make sure that the new page is selected. So that's all pretty basic stuff for adding new tabs. And then here is where we start to deal with the container. So we're creating a new instance of our container that's down here, HTML container. And we're calling this right here. This is the magic method that allows you to add it dynamically. And there's 2 of these that are available. The one that I'm using right here is embed within panel. There's also just embed within that allows you to add a container directly to a window or a control on the window. And we'll see how that is used in the last example that shows you how to create kind of a download control like you might see in a web browser like Firefox or something like that. So embed with panel embeds this container within a panel at a specific page. So we've got the name of the panel right here. So we're saying embed with panel. This is the panel we want to embed it in. We know the page because that's why we saved it right up here. So we want to embed it in the last page that was appended. And then here you just are specifying the coordinates, left and top, and then width and height. So essentially I'm sticking the panel, the container inside the panel at a particular position, and then I'm making sure it's sized appropriately for the width and the height. And the width's always just the window width, and then the height is just however high the darn thing is. And then I have a few other methods and properties that are set here to make sure that focus is set appropriately. And we set the parent window. We have a parent window property on the container, so the container can actually call methods on the window to do certain things. And we'll probably have time to jump in and see how some of that's working. And then the other important thing that's being done here is I'm maintaining an array on the window of each container that I add. And this is so that I can reference the containers later. Technically, in this example, I don't actually have the code at this point, but one thing that would be probably a good thing to add, if you're, because every browser has this, is when you open up your tabs, usually there's a way to close them after. And I didn't add a button here to say close tab, and that'll be the sort of thing I'll tweak before that gets added to Xojo Release 3. But in order for me to be able to close everything up properly, I want to have a reference to it so I can call the close method. So that's why we're saving the container off into array so that we have access to that. It might also be used in one of these other methods, which we will see as we dig around in it. But that's certainly one use for it. And then this particular thing actually returns the HTML viewer that was created back. It doesn't have to do that, but because of some of the more advanced functions that's down here, I think this was needed in order to support the open in new tab by right-clicking on a link. And this is the sort of stuff that as I was adding this, I was like, oh, well, it'd be great if it did this to show off this feature. And then I went back and tweaked the interface a little bit. But we'll see when we get back to the container control how most of this functionality is actually in the container itself. It's not in the window. I mean, you're looking at the extent of the window code. Well, not the complete extent of it, but the rest of it is pretty simple stuff because it's just essentially it's routing code that's saying, all right, toolbar, what do I do when certain buttons are pushed? The timer is just checking page titles, making sure they get updated, and then adding the new tab. So there's really not a lot of code here on the window itself. There's more code on the container though. All right, so let's just see what we got here, start in the right spots. So we get the container again, only 2 controls on here. This is the address control. So let's look at the key down event handler for the address. And this just checks if the user pressed return, then we're going to check what they typed, and then tell the HTML viewer to do something. So here, this particular code is just checking if they've typed anything that, if it doesn't start with HTTP or HTTPS, and it doesn't contain a dot anywhere in it, then we're going to send it off to Google search and presume that they wanted to do a search on that because we don't have an actual URL. If it just happened to be missing the prefixes, we'll add the prefix. But if it had everything, then we just can load up the address as is. And then the address gets loaded. And that calls load URL, which has just 1 line of code at the moment. Could possibly have other, as you know, this thing got more complicated. But this just tells the HTML viewer to load the URL. So these 2 things are responsible for displaying in the viewer what was typed. The go back method calls the go back method on the viewer. And you'll see this is used right here in toolbar, the routing code right here. And this is another example of usage of the array. I'm able to reference the container for the specific page that happens to be the current page. So this gives me the reference to the container. And then I can call the go back method on it, which calls this, which then passes this on to the actual HTML viewer. So you'll notice here that we are not calling or talking to the HTML viewer directly. You probably could because I haven't specifically made it private. But generally speaking, when you're making your things like this, you want to, restrict dependencies. So there's not a lot of reason to directly access the HTML viewer. You should probably create your own method and API to do that. In case the go back method needed to do something else. What if I needed to maintain, what if I had a history that I was maintaining and I wanted to go back to somehow interact with that? Well, this method would be the place for it. Versus if you called go back directly on the HTML viewer, well, you're just calling it directly on the HTML viewer. You don't have any way to manage that extra functionality that you want it to do. The other methods on here don't do a heck of a lot. The select address field is just setting the focus on the address field. And again, that's used when the new tab is created so that the cursor is in the right place so the user can start typing immediately. And again, you could have directly called set focus on the address field, but you are not going to want to do that when you're properly encapsulating your code. By having it in its own method like this, I could actually rename the field and it wouldn't break my API here on the browser window. I would just need to fix the container itself. Just lots of little things like that make it really smart to separate your layout and it's the way you're accessing it. And what do we have for the other method that's on here? And getHTML viewer actually returns the HTML viewer back. And again, this is done as opposed to directly accessing it via the container control. And the other thing to just look at is the event handlers right here. So if you see on the HTML viewer, there's 2 event handlers that we're particularly interested in. New window is the one that's called when you right click on a link and you say open in new window. And normally this would be you'd create a whole new window and put your tab on, put your HTML viewer on it, and then the URL would be displayed there. But instead, what we really want to do is take that and throw it up on a new tab. So in this particular case, we're making use of the parent window property that we specified. And we just verify that one was actually specified so that we don't accidentally raise a nil object exception. And if it is, we're calling the add new tab method, which is on the window itself. And that kind of makes sense because add new tab is where we're always calling to add a new tab. So we're not going to two different places to do this functionality. It's always the window that's responsible for adding the tab. So we're essentially here saying, hey, the current HTML viewer said, hey, the user just told me that this link they want to see in a new tab. Well, I don't know anything about tabs. I'm just a viewer. So I'm going to tell my parent who's responsible for all this tab management, hey, I got something for you. You need to add a new tab. And this is the HTML viewer you want to show it on. And so boom, it does that. It passes it right up the chain, essentially. And that's how you end up with this example that shows you how you can, create a bunch of tabs, type whatever you want in here. And you get a neat little web browser that's even more useful. And of course, you could add, more functionality than we even have here. Like I said, I'll be including this example with Xojo itself. It'll be beefed up a little bit, so I'll actually have some icons in here. I'll have the ability to close the tab. I don't think I'll add any ability to manage history or anything like that. That'll be a fun little exercise for people. But that's the sort of thing you can add with this because you now have some of the ability to notice where the pages are going and whatnot. I don't think I've hooked up the forward or refresh buttons, so those will be hooked up, that sort of thing. But you can start to see how you can use this in your own apps with this particular example. All right, before I jump into the even longer example, I want to just run this poll here because I forgot to do this last week. So we have a little poll that just popped up. Marketing loves it when I run these things. So if you could certainly take a moment and just answer this one little question, I think it's only a one-question poll, that would be great while I load up this next project here. All right, thanks everyone. Close the poll. All right. So here we have example project that demonstrates how you might make a download control. So let's just run this so you can see what it looks like. Now it's not actually downloading anything, it's simulating that, but the important concepts are how it's doing it. So, and of course you could extend it to download things if you want to play around with some HTTP sockets or whatnot. Again, a fun little exercise. But the important thing here is this creates a little download control here. And each time we click the button, a new little viewer download thing appears. You'll notice, all right, I've clicked it 4 times. I can use the scroll bar here and start to scroll. And you'll see the controls are what's scrolling, which is pretty cool. You'll see this one is going to finish before the others. And you'll see when it's done, and now it changes and says download complete. I can click this cleanup button, and that one goes away. The others shift up. So now there's only 3 that are on there. I can hit the cancel button, stop one, hit the cleanup, goes away. This is all done with containers. Each one of these individual things that you see here is a container. This is just a window. The containers in this particular case are actually being added to a canvas control that you don't see. It's just a hidden canvas control. These things are being added to. And the canvas control is what is allowing us to scroll in conjunction with a scroll bar that's sitting off over here to the side. So this project's a little bit more advanced, or maybe a lot more advanced, but let's take a look at it. Now the first thing you'll see is the main window, not much on here, a button. And I think you're going to see that the button itself doesn't even do much. The button really is just maintaining a file counter so that the downloaded file has a number after it, so we can know how many times we've clicked the button. And then it instantiates the download window, and if it hasn't already been instantiated, and it shows it. And that's the extent of the code on that window, because that doesn't really do much. The download window itself, this is what has the container, the canvas, the scroll bar, all kinds of stuff. So if I click right in here, we're looking, actually it doesn't have the container yet because the container is added dynamically at runtime. So forget I said that. But it has the canvas and the scroller. So I have a canvas on here that I just called the download scroll view. And I have a scroll bar off to the side. Actually, these things don't do anything. I pretty much based this whole thing on how the Firefox download window looked. Actually, Safari and Chrome don't appear to use download windows anymore. Safari has the weird little download pop-up that it shows, and I think Chrome has a separate page. And I think Safari used to do something like this, but Firefox still does. And I said, this fits my example better, so I was copying what Firefox looked like. And there's just a cleanup button on here that goes through and removes containers that are either canceled or finished, and then shuffles things around so that there aren't big gaps in the middle or whatnot. And you can see right here, there's a fair amount of code on the download window. So I think maybe we'll get back to that. But first, but we'll jump to the download container here. So this is a layout for the download container. And you can see this, is the small little thing. It has the file name, a little progress bar, cancel button, and then a field that shows the download rate. This is all faking a download. I just have a timer that's sitting down here that runs. So when we essentially add a file to this, we're just setting a fake duration for how long the download would take. And then the timer runs through that duration until and then updates the progress bar and generates fake numbers for the download stats and whatnot. Certainly this is the place where if you actually wanted this to download something, you could change the method right here called start download and have it actually accept a URL and then connect to an HTTP socket to start downloading the file. And you would do all that stuff in here. But that wouldn't really affect how the download container itself works, as you're just changing the details of the implementation that's in there to actually do something real rather than something fake. But anyway, this is the layout of the container, which is really what matters the most in this particular case. So again, nothing terribly fancy about its layout. I don't even know that there's any really cool code in here. The cancel button has a little bit of code that just sets a status and stops the timer to pretend that the download's been canceled. And the timer, like I mentioned before, isn't doing anything real. It's just generating some random numbers for transfer rates and updating the progress bar. Here on the download window, though, is where all the containers are added. So you can see right here on the download, add download method. And you'll see that this code looks pretty similar to what the tab web browser example code looked like. We're creating a new container. We're adding it to an array so that we can reference it later when we need to. We're calling the start download method on the container itself, which is responsible for starting up the timer and starting the fake download process. And then we have this code here that's calculating the position that we want to display the container on in the window so that they appear one underneath each other. Then we embed the container, and this time it's calling just embed within rather than embed within panel because we don't have a panel control. And it's being embedded into the canvas. And then it's just embedding it right at the left side, but it's using the offset for the height so that it knows where to put it. And then it also tweaks the scroll bar with that offset so that the scroll bar adjusts itself depending on how many times we click the download button, essentially, or how many of those little containers are on there. So that's the setup for this. And you see that's pretty simple and straightforward. Now let's take a look at Well, first we'll look at the cleanup button before we get to the scrolling, because I bet some of you think the scrolling might be pretty neat. You can see here the cleanup button as the comment here. Actually, I actually commented some of the code here, things I want to do before I actually get this into the Xojo, the next Xojo release. So the first thing we do is we go through and remove any completed or canceled downloads. So we're checking the status. If they are getting removed, we're first readjusting the height of the scroll bar so that, again, that little slider control adjusts itself appropriately. And then the downloader is removed by calling the close method. So the download container is removed. And then finally, now that we've gotten rid of everything, we can just get rid of it from the array because we don't care about it anymore. An important thing to note here is the reverse order. I'm starting at the top of the array and working my way down to the bottom. Anytime you're calling remove, because you're yanking things from an array, you want to go in reverse order. If you forget to do that and you go bottom up, you'll eventually remove enough elements such that you're going to get an out of bounds exception. If I go from 0 to 10 to start removing items and I remove item 0, the counters end up changing, and at some point you're going to end up trying to remove item 6 and there were only 5 items left, and boom, you get an out of bounds error, and it's going to tick you off. So always remember to count reverse order if you're removing things from an array. After we remove the stuff from the array, we now have the list of items that are still chugging away. We just go back and tweak their tops so that we essentially are getting rid of any gaps that might have been there. If number 2 finished before number 1 and number 3, and you hit the cleanup button, well, yank out number 2, slide number 3 up. Everything looks nice. So that's all the cleanup button does. And then the scroller is taking advantage of the fact that a canvas is a pretty powerful control in Xojo and can be used not only to display graphics, but to contain controls, and with its built-in scroll method, can scroll those controls. So all I'm doing here is I'm noting how far the scroll bar has been moved by calculating the delta from this last position to the current position. And then I'm calling the canvas scroll method. And you can see down here at the bottom, it's a very long list of parameters. And I'm passing in 0 for the first parameter because we don't have horizontal scrolling, which is what the X would be. We're only scrolling up or down. So Y is what matters. We're scrolling at the delta, which is how much the scroll bar moved, which we calculated. Again, we're not changing the position of the control. And I guess the widths are just being whatever the width of the control of the canvas is. But the important parameter is this last one here, which is move controls is Boolean equals true. And the default is true, so I could have left it off, but I put it there to be specific because you can turn it off if you just have graphics on here and you have controls that you don't actually want to move. But this is the canvas will move the controls with you when you scroll, which is great. So this one line of code, essentially, with these little bit of tweak lines here to track some values so we know how far to scroll, is scrolling the controls for us. And then so that the mouse wheel works, I also added line of code here to tweak the value of the scroller based on how much the mouse wheel's changed. And if we, yeah, I guess that's it. So if we run the project again, you can see this. Add a couple. So if I put I can scroll it. I'm using the mouse wheel right now to scroll it. I can tab around here, move that, do that sort of thing. I can pause these, clean them up. It all works just great, and it's all because of containers. Now, if you didn't have containers, how the heck would you even do this? Well, that would be probably possible, but quite a pain in the butt. The other thing you can fall back on if you need to add controls dynamically to a window is to use control sets. But that only allows you to deal with one control at a time. It does have the benefit of kind of grouping all the events for all the multiple controls in one place, which can be handy if that's how you're working with your particular design. But for something like this, with a container that has multiple controls on it, you'd essentially need a control set for 1, 2, 3, 4 controls and have to manage all those separately and their coordinates when you were adding them and removing them and all that sort of stuff. Whereas when it's all encapsulated in the container, we don't have to worry about how many are in here. We're just dealing with the container. If I needed to add more things, one thing that Firefox has that I did not add is they have an icon that shows here on the left-hand side that shows the type of the file that's being downloaded. So if I wanted to add an icon to this implementation, I would just add the icon. And it wouldn't affect anything else because the coordinates and everything else are handled by the container. The window doesn't care about if we're showing an icon there, if we've changed this to be right aligned, if I've put the data transfer at the top and the file name at the bottom, or changed this to be a completely different time of progress bar, doesn't matter. But to demonstrate that for completeness, I think I have a control set example here. Yes, I do. Let's just run this project so you can see how control sets also work. So I see this a lot on the forum where people ask, well, how do I add stuff dynamically to Windows? And the answer is always, well, use control sets or use container controls. And there's pros and cons to each. Generally, I personally steer more towards container controls because they are more powerful. But there's times when you don't need that power, and a control set is perfectly fine. So here you can see I can add 10, and boom, 10 things were added. I can type text here. Only the related one is updated because of the way the code is, which we'll see in a moment. We can change this, and now there's 5, drop it down to 1. And that's all based on how the code is that I've put in here. So let's look at that. These 3 controls right here are control sets. So if I click on one, you'll see in the inspector in the control set section, it'll say it's a member of button label, which is the actual name of the control, and that this one has an index of 0. Now I could add multiple controls on a window and set them as control sets, but we're not really caring about that right now because we're using these as a way to dynamically add controls to a window at runtime. Now you notice when we first ran the project and we were looking at it, there wasn't any controls that were down here. And that's because these are all set to invisible by default. So we're not really messing around with these because these essentially become our pattern controls. They're our base controls. So we want to keep these around because if these go away, well, then we can't create new controls off of them. So we keep these around, we have them hidden, and we use them to create new controls. And they're all set up the same way with control sets. And you can see over here in the navigator what that looks like. It has a little members thing, and it shows the control set name. Now, if I go to the pop-up that lets us specify how many of these things to display, you can see here, nothing terribly sophisticated. The first thing it does is just removing all the buttons that have been previously added. That this way we don't end up with duplicates essentially. Or I shouldn't say duplicates, but the wrong count. Because if we keep kicking 5, we could get 5 more added each time, and then we'd end up with more than 5. Again, it depends how you'd want to implement it, but I wanted just the number that was clicked. All right, so we loop through how many were specified to add. And then this is how you add a new control to a window, is you use the new command with the name of the control set. And once you have that new control, which we just assigned to its own type, you can tweak all the properties and do what you want. So in this case, we're tweaking its positioning, and we're making sure that we make it visible, since our pattern one is invisible by default. And we just have to tweak the top so they show, one underneath each other. And we have to do that for each control. So you can see this very simple example that is just demonstrating really how control sets work already has, a fair amount of repeating code to do a lot of the same thing. So imagine if you had a bunch of controls that you were trying to specifically manage coordinates for. This could quickly become rather hairy to play around with. You'd have all kinds of, math to figure out, relative positions to things. If you added a new control, you'd have to update code in this loop to, position it in the right spot. It quickly starts to get to be more of a pain than it's worth, in my opinion. But if you just have a couple little controls to work with in a specific situation, this is pretty fast and easy. And then you can see down on the controls themselves, if you click on the action event, you can just see an example of how the each control is showing just the caption for itself. And that's by using the index property that now appears here because it is a control set. And the same thing on the text field. Sets the button that matches the index of the field that's being edited. So that way we only changed, the button text. But it doesn't have to be that way. You could, monkey around with these and do whatever you wanted. So that's how control sets would work for adding controls dynamically to your windows. Like I said, I personally prefer containers, but this is a pretty cool option as well for simpler setups. Like I think I've said a few times now, all of these examples are going to be in Xojo for release 3. I just got a few more tweaking to do them, put some comments in place, but they'll definitely be in release 3. They'll be wrapped up this week for inclusion. And but I'll also make them available when I put up the recording of this webinar as well, so that everyone that's listening to the webinar will have them to play around with and use them as reference as they now start to test out container controls in your own projects and see how they can greatly simplify perhaps some layouts or designs that you've already made. So I've been talking nonstop. I'm going to pause, take a drink. Well, maybe some of you type in some questions. I don't see anything showing up on the question list, so either you all fell asleep or you all wrapped with my examples here. All right, let's see. I still don't see any questions, so well, that's either good or bad. I'll take that as good. And I will point out that next week's topic is very similar to this. I'm also covering container controls, but for web projects. The container control is also available for web projects, and again, is very useful there, particularly because of the different layouts that you have on web projects. One thing we'll show is how to do a custom control using a container control. I think I have an example of a combo box that we're going to try. And you commonly would use container controls for handling things like navigators that might run across all your pages. And you want to, show well, you're now on this section of the site or the app, and you can click to jump around. So we'll see how a container could be used for that, among other things. But again, they work very similar to desktop ones, so we'll play around with some examples for that. Let's see, I got more of a comment from Marcus here. I'm going to click on that and read the whole thing. All right, let's see. No, there's a question there at the end. Container controls and databases. Search a table and display the results in the list box. How would you organize that? That's a great question, Marcus. Let's go back to the first example if I still have that open. I do not, so let's do that. This first example is probably how I would organize that. As you can see here, if you, this could be an example of such a thing here, looking at the orders container. I've got a list box here, and I have a search. This is a container, but it could just, these fields could be by themselves up here. And essentially, this could be searching an orders table for, say, whatever you type in here for a customer name, for example. So I could theoretically type in, Acme here, hit search, and then it would query the database and only show the results that are right here. This would be no different than how you would do it using a normal window. The benefit is that the code is now all self-contained. The search code, if you're specifically searching an orders table, is all contained right here in the orders container, which makes some amount of sense. If you had, the button down here to add a new order, it probably makes sense that it might even be here. It's even possible that you might enhance this so that this particular container had, say, a page panel on it. The first panel might be this list. If you hit the add order button, maybe it switches you over to a new page panel that has a bunch of fields on there that you'd fill in for the order. And then when you click the save button, it goes back to the list here and it shows you the list with that new order now appearing. A lot of options for how you would design it. But once you put it in a container, it all becomes completely encapsulated. Your window doesn't know or care that all of a sudden your add order button is sliding over to a new tab, a new page panel, and displaying fields for you to type there. What if it turns out you built it that way, you shipped it off to the customer to test, and they're like, oh, well, that's pretty cool, but I'd rather it showed the add order as a modal window rather than sliding over into another page like that. You'd be like, okay, well, no problem. I'll just change this button here, have it display a modal window with the fields in it. So they click save, it does the same thing as before. But your window and the rest of your app doesn't care, doesn't need to change because it's all encapsulated within this container. So it's a design philosophy, but it forces you to think about the design of your app a little bit better, so you don't end up with this giant complex set of windows that do too many things. You've now broken your app into smaller pieces that each do more focused things. That's easier to maintain, easier to change, that sort of thing. All right. I'm checking the question list. I don't see anything else. So I want to thank everyone for attending. Be on the lookout for this recording and the example of projects appearing on, if I can get Safari to come back up here, on the doc page where we have all these things here. So if I go to right here, the main page, docs.xojo.com, training and tutorial videos, the webinar section will have this one appear here, hopefully by the end of the week, if all goes well. And I'll have an additional links here for the package of example projects for you all to grab and play around with and learn from, hopefully. So again, thanks everyone for attending. We really appreciate people attending these things live. And be sure to stay tuned next week for the companion container control webinar. And have a great rest of your day.